Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking your Friday lunch hour to join us today. Today's webinar is being brought to you by Thousand Friends of Oregon, Housing Development Center, Housing Oregon, League of Oregon Cities, Oregon Association of Special Districts, and Metro, which is the regional government agency charged with long-range planning and voter-approved bond investments in Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington counties. My name is Tracy Manning. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Development Center. We are a nonprofit consulting group that for the last 30 years has been assisting communities throughout the state of Oregon to build and sustain affordable housing. And prior to HDC, I worked in local government as the director of the Portland Housing Bureau. I am also a native Oregonian, and native Oregonians know that every one of our communities is special, and every Oregon city and town is the same in that we work hard every day to meet the needs of our residents, from clean air and water to public safety, garbage collection, and housing. We want to make housing available to the seniors in our towns, to the workers, our young adults starting families, and those experiencing homelessness. And when we try to make it cost effective or even possible for housing to get built in our communities, we very often hit a big barrier: infrastructure. At HDC, we have plenty of stories of housing not built in Oregon towns for lack of a water sewer system, lighting, roads, maybe transit, bicycle, pedestrian access. And I'm sure there are shelves full of those stories that could be told by people in this room. So what do we do about it? The co-hosts of today's webinar have invited 4 guest speakers from 3 state agencies in California who are partnering with their local and regional communities to overcome some of these infrastructure barriers. So we're really grateful to them for spending time with us today. They're going to share some lessons they've learned so that we can maybe identify solutions that would be a fit in Oregon. So we'll hear from our panelists first, and then at around 1 o'clock, we'll open the floor up for questions and conclude with a final takeaway from each of our panelists so that we can wrap it up at 1:30. Really pleased to introduce our panelists today: Deputy Secretary Sasha Kurgan from the cabinet level California Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency; Craig Shields, Section Chief at the California Department of Housing and Community Development; Jennifer Seeger, Deputy Director of Financial Assistance at the California Department of Housing and Community Development; and Lena Moeller from the California Infrastructure Bank. And now I will turn it over to Deputy Secretary Sasha Kurgan.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for all of the co-hosts for inviting California to speak to all of these friends in Oregon. We're really excited to be here. I have a presentation to guide so that I don't talk too much and that you can hear from the rest of the presenters. Crystal, do you mind sharing the slides? I'll introduce myself first. As Tracy mentioned, I'm the Deputy Secretary for Housing at a cabinet level agency called the Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency. Our mission is to ensure there's housing for all Californians, prevent and end homelessness, protect civil rights, and ensure consumer protections. We have 12 departments and 40 boards and bureaus under our agency. My portfolio is solely focused on housing. I work directly with the Department of the Department of Housing and Community Development, and you'll hear from 2 colleagues there a little bit later today. Also with the California Housing Finance Agency and the Department of Real Estate. I also do a lot of interagency work on how housing connects to our work on climate, transportation, energy, homelessness, and many more topics. So it's a robust portfolio. But today, and next slide, please, I'm going to be focusing on how our approach to building momentum on housing has shown up primarily in planning and then manifested through programs. And not going to talk as much about some of the legislative tools that we have, but I'll give a nod to them. And then how specifically on through those programs, we're trying to scale solutions to create more housing throughout the state, in communities, in partnership with local government. And so that's the high level view of today. Next slide, please. So this looks busy, but it's a very abbreviated timeline showing what the last several years have looked like and the ways that we've built momentum to accelerate housing development throughout our state. It's no secret that there have been decades of underproduction of housing in our state. This is a national trend, and we've really felt it here, and we're not shy about talking about it. But in order to do this, we've required support from not only the administration, but from the legislature, from all of our departments, not just those that are working on housing, and then many partners locally, regionally, and federally. And so this kind of shows how we've built this momentum through several years. So 2017 was really notable. It was the first time that we had a legislative housing package, and it was stunning to have 15 bills signed by the governor at the time that were focused on housing. That was momentous in itself. But we also had released from the Department of Housing and Community Development a statewide housing assessment that laid out some of the policy goals that were reflected within that first housing package. In 2018, as part of that package, we released our first housing planning grant program to support local governments in implementing these new laws and getting ready for the next wave of planning cycles. I won't get too far into it. Like, it's the regional housing needs assessment and how that builds into housing elements. That's not the focus of today, but just trust we acknowledged that local governments we knew that there was a lot of work that was needed, and there hadn't been support for planning grants in a long time. At the same time, we were daylighting a lot of data so that we could help make more data-informed policy decisions, not only statewide, but help encourage locals to reflect upon their data, to identify where there were barriers to housing development. 2019, Governor Newsom gets elected, and housing is a key part of his agenda. And that felt very new for many other state departments and for local governments who were feeling this renewed attention to not only housing goals, but that the goals and commitments need to realize into action. In 2020, we all know what happened, and we really turned and pivoted to an extreme focus on housing, homelessness, and public health. Home Key was the governor's signature program to address this, but it also showed a little bit of the art of the possible when state and local governments focus and work on a shared goal to create more housing for those who need it. 2021, the new housing cycle starts. I'll talk about the big numbers that we're all planning for. And at the same time, we're not just doing incentives, but also making sure that the agreements that people are making when it comes to their housing goals are real. So we do have a housing accountability focus as well to make sure that the laws are being implemented fairly and appropriately. 2022, I'll show you some glimpses from our new statewide housing plan. It's all online. I'd encourage you to read it if you're interested in it. And throughout several years, that is not on the slide, but we've had more legislative housing packages. We've had more housing budget investments, but the budget investment in 2022 included the catalytic infill infrastructure grant program, which Craig and Jennifer will talk about in detail. This year, we announced those grants, and the governor signed an additional 50 plus bills. So it's been an exciting year. So that's some of the momentum. Next slide, please. Okay, statewide housing plan. This is where we are articulating many things, including our planning goal that local governments have to plan for, zone for 2.5 million units statewide, and that planning exercise completes around 2030. Within the state, I realize that is like a very astonishing number, but it's real. That is to account for housing need, it's to account for overcrowding, it's to account for homes lost in disasters, it's many, many things, and it also shows the pent-up demand for housing. So lots on that goal in our statewide housing plan. Within our plan, we have 3 objectives: keep Californians in their home, build more climate smart and affordable housing, and then continue acting with urgency to address housing and homelessness. This is not just about a planning goal. We need to be acting right now, and we're excited and very proud of our jurisdictions and our state for making really affirmative efforts in that regard. Meanwhile, with all this efforts, the 2018 planning grants were not the last time that we deployed housing planning grants to local governments. What started out as a one-time prospect with empirically backed strategies to accelerate housing development turned into a local early action planning grant, and then a regional early action planning grant named LEAP and REAP respectively. We issued REAP 2.0 this year, and it's really the convergence of housing, transportation, and climate planning all in one. So there's been continued to support to local and regional governments to help set the table and build on this momentum by setting the foundation from a planning perspective for housing. Next slide. Okay, great. I just want to zero in on this because it's in our statewide housing plan and just acknowledges some of the reasons why we're in this predicament of not having enough housing. And some of this shows up in the lack of infrastructure funding. At the very middle of the slide, you'll see federal support has not kept up with the need. And a lot of people think about that as there's not enough housing choice vouchers. And I believe that to be true. But I also believe that there hasn't been enough infrastructure dollars going in. And notably, people talk about that as roads and bridges, but we'll talk about how that relates to housing in just a moment. So next slide. Okay. I know, and Tracy acknowledged in the beginning, there's a framework in Oregon of all the different players, and how we get housing built is in some part related to public funding, especially when it comes to affordable housing. We have quite a web of team members in our state in different departments, sometimes different constitutional offices that are bringing together investments to make it easier to build housing with public financing. And so housing and community development here today, housing finance agency, they're more for mortgage lender, single family and multifamily. We have the Interagency Council on Homelessness. They do have funding that's going sometimes to support operations. The Strategic Growth Council weaves together climate investments. Tax Credit Allocation Committee and the Debt Limit Allocation Committee are both from our treasurer's office, but that's credits and bonds respectively. And this is part of how we're financing housing. But some of the power of state law, I'd say, is to really decrease the time value of money calculation by making it easier to build housing. And so we hope that our public dollars go further. But I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that our programs can be quite complicated. We own that and try and make it easier, but it's not for the faint of heart. So this is some of our team. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have all this funding for housing development, but we still have these challenges that persist, some of which Tracy alluded to. I think of infrastructure as part of the connective tissue for communities. It's the wet and dry utilities, it's our roads, it's all kinds of things. And without ongoing investment, we have aging infrastructure, and we have a lot of it in infill areas. And that lack of investment makes it harder for communities to say yes to housing. It makes it hard for those infrastructure needs to get handled. And so what we've found, and those of us who have developed housing outside of the state have probably felt this in our own projects before. You're going in, you have a vision for an affordable or market rate development, and you're getting through the entitlements process, and you start having conversations with cities or counties telling you that there are other needs surrounding the parcel that you're developing on that have to be done in order for housing to go in there. And so this is one of the key components of housing development costs in a time when there's not enough infrastructure funding, that those infrastructure needs are often assigned to and then absorbed by the housing project. And that increases the housing development cost. It increases the complexity of the project. It increases the scope, and it's all for the good of the community, for amenities that are going to be needed to keep that development and often the surrounding community safer. So I'm not arguing that the infrastructure needs are real. I'm just arguing that those are part of the costs that are making housing development more expensive. And also, if the cities don't have dollars for those infrastructure needs, then they are kind of hamstrung in that regard. So we were reflecting on this and reflecting on how to build upon all of that housing momentum that I was describing, those plans that we don't want to just sit on the shelf, but rather visions that are expressed by communities to inform those plans about where and how housing should happen in communities. We wanted to build on that and also acknowledge that we don't have enough public subsidy to finance all of the infrastructure as well, though I'm excited to hear from iBank on this too. So we're exploring other ways to build on this momentum. And if you take me to the next slide, please. So in comes this program, which Craig and Jen will talk about in more detail, but I just high level what we were trying to do, and in our conversations with legislative partners as we were trying to get this program into the budget and over the finish line, is to say we have a lot of local governments who have effectively set the table for housing. They have done all these things on the left side of the slide. They've identified and removed barriers to housing development, leaning on the power of state law, leaning on the specific plans, the housing elements, their general plan updates that have said, this is where we want it to happen. They've planned for housing. They are ready to facilitate housing development. They are not going to throw a flag on the play. They know where it is to happen. And they've engaged the community on this and have integrated that input into their vision. And so now we're looking for ways to kind of continue those conditions and give local governments the ability to provide that connective tissue. And so instead of going on a project by project level approach, we said, local governments, tell us what amenities you need, tell us in what ways you've made ready your community for housing to happen, and where you can step in to decrease additional barriers, specifically on infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so before I turn it to Jen and Craig, I just want to say that in order to scale solutions like this, where we give and acknowledge the partnership between state and local government, I think that we can work together, certainly within our state, and I'm sure Oregon and other states can do it as well, that we can help catalyze what communities have asked for and what local governments are ready to say yes to facilitate housing development and community development with amenities for existing and new community members through these infrastructure investments. And so we're hopeful to keep identifying strategies and real funding from recent federal infrastructure funding to do more things like this. We know that these solutions are needed in our densely populated cities, but they're needed in rural areas as well, and everything in between. And so we're looking to identify these best practices and tell the story of how additional funding could help do more. With that, I'll say thanks. Next slide, please. My contact information will be available. Please feel free to reach out, but I'll turn it over to HCD. Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Good afternoon. I'm Craig Shields with the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. I serve as the chief of our Climate Investments branch, where I lead the teams that design and implement affordable housing and infrastructure funding programs that consider the nexus between affordable housing and climate change. And I'm ready for our slides. Thank you. Our department provides loans and grants from both state and federal funding sources to create rental and homeownership opportunities for Californians from all walks of life, including veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, farm workers, and those experiencing homelessness. Over the past few decades, HCD has provided funding for thousands of affordable homes and related infrastructure. But we're not just a funding source. The department also manages the titling and registration for manufactured homes, floating homes, and truck campers. HCD also protects the health and safety of Californians by enforcing standards for housing construction, maintenance of farm worker housing, and factory-built homes. Next slide, please. As Sasha mentioned, California's housing crisis is a half century in the making, brought by decades of underproduction, underscored by exclusionary policies, have left housing supply far behind our goals. The historic California Comeback Plan of 2021 provided over $10 billion, by far the most ever invested in housing, into a comprehensive affordable housing strategy while implementing new laws and accountability measures. Building on these unprecedented efforts, the 2022 budget invested an additional $3.4 billion for affordable housing. And this year, the 2023 state budget provides another $3.3 billion for various housing and homelessness programs. And earlier this month, Governor Newsom signed 56 bills into law that reduce barriers to housing and support the development of more affordable homes. This legislation streamlines housing development, allows institutions like colleges and religious organizations to use portions of their property to build housing, and continues to hold local communities accountable for their fair share of housing. Next slide, please. By administering funding programs that provide grants and loans to cities, counties, tribal entities, and developers, HCD fulfills our mission to promote safe, affordable homes and vibrant, sustainable communities for all Californians. To achieve our mission, we weave multiple goals into our programs, including equity, climate resilience, home ownership, farm worker housing, addressing homelessness, housing for veterans, disaster recovery, infrastructure, adaptive reuse of underutilized buildings, pet assistance, and making excess state-owned properties available for housing. Next slide, please. HCD's fairly new Supernova is designed to help accelerate housing production so developers, localities, and community partners can more efficiently get the dollars they need to finance these really complex housing developments. Signed by Governor Newsom in 2020, Assembly Bill 434 requires HCD to issue a single Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA, that aligns several of our key funding sources. First, our multifamily housing program, the Veterans Housing and Homelessness Program, the Joe Cerna Farm Worker Housing Program, and the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. Next slide, please. The Multifamily Housing Program, or MHP, provides permanent financing for affordable multifamily rental, new construction, rehabilitation, and conversion housing developments. MHP awards are 3% simple interest, long-term deferred payment loans for housing and related infrastructure. Next slide, please. California is home to the largest veteran population in the nation, and unfortunately, many veterans experience homelessness. In 2014, California voters approved Proposition 41, which provided $600 million to fund the Veterans Housing and Homelessness Prevention Program, which HCD administers in partnership with the California Department of Veterans Affairs. This program prioritizes applications that leverage public, private, and nonprofit resources, foster innovative financing opportunities, and demonstrate experience in combining housing with critical supportive services for veterans. Next slide, please. Farm workers earn, on average, less than 20% of the area median income in many California communities, making farm workers and their families among the most economically vulnerable people in our state. The Joe Cerna Farm Worker Housing Program provides low-interest, deferred payment loans for rental housing and grants for owner-occupied housing that is made available to agricultural workers and their families. The program was originally funded through Proposition 1C in 2006. Next slide, please. Also originally funded through Proposition 1C, the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, or IIG, received additional funding through Proposition 1 in 2018 and has received general fund dollars since 2019. The primary objective of our IIG program is to promote infill development. We accomplish that by providing grants for infrastructure improvements, which now includes factory-built housing, and adaptive reuse, converting non-residential structures to housing. IIG encourages partnerships between cities or counties and developers to identify infrastructure needs that would otherwise prevent production of new housing in infill locations. But encouraging development in the urban core helps achieve many of our objectives. First, by avoiding sprawl development, we further California's goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by building housing near the places we all want and need to go each day, like grocery stores, healthcare, schools, and jobs. But building housing on tight urban sites is not without challenges. We often find decades-old infrastructure, dilapidated roads and sidewalks, crumbling water pipes, and insufficient power lines. The state remains committed to making funding available to unlock these amenity-rich sites for housing. Next slide. And my favorite, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, or AHSC, whose purpose is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by funding new housing, transportation infrastructure, and greenhouse gas reducing programs. Funding for the AHSC program is provided from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, an account established to receive cap and trade auction proceeds, similar to Oregon's Climate Protection Program. HCD administers the program in partnership with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Strategic Growth Council, and California Air Resources Board. Our most competitive applications come from partnerships between housing developers and local governments or transit agencies. These applications also often achieve the right mix of new housing, infrastructure, and transit improvements to help build communities that are less dependent on single occupancy vehicles. This year, in our 7th round of funding, we awarded a little more than $750 million, which will support over 2,500 new housing units, along with miles of sidewalks and bikeways, and a few dozen zero-emission train cars and buses. Next slide, please. HCD's Home Key program has become a national model to rapidly house people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Home Key is an opportunity for California communities to develop or upgrade a broad range of housing types, including hotels, motels, single-family homes, and multifamily apartments, manufactured housing, and to convert underutilized commercial properties and other existing buildings to permanent or interim housing. Home Key has created more than 12,000 units of interim and permanent housing for people experiencing homelessness at a fraction of the cost of creating a new unit and in record time. Next slide. And finally, our excess sites local government matching grants program provides grant-based funding to match local government dollars for selected developers and local governments to build affordable housing on underutilized state-owned excess sites. Next slide, please. And all of this funding is really making a difference. Over the past few years, we have supported 24 group homes, 24 migrant centers, 113 emergency shelters, 372 homeownership loans, and 1,228 multifamily projects. Next slide. Those 1,228 projects add up to over 70,000 units, housing for more than 185,000 people, which is a little more than the population of Salem. So imagine building new housing to house everyone from Salem. Next slide. Based on recent awards and projects under construction, within the next 2 to 3 years, we'll be adding more than 43,000 new units throughout the state. Adding that to our existing portfolio will mean that HCD will house more than 300,000 individuals in just a few years. And next slide. Next slide, please. One more, sorry. And here is our calendar that brings it all together. About once a year, we post the NOFA calendar, or what I like to call the thing that keeps me up at night. It lists all available funding, NOFA dates, amount of available funding, application timelines, and award dates. At the moment, we have so many NOFAs, this calendar is basically unreadable when printed. So just take a look at our website, Google HCD NOFA calendar, and there it is. Our website also provides full information on all of our current funding opportunities. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you in Oregon today. I'm going to pass the microphone to Jennifer Seeger.
Oh, Jennifer.
My apologies. Am I better? Good to go? Thanks. So thank you for allowing us to be part of your presentation here today. And thanks, Craig, for digging in and giving a little information on our various multifamily funding programs. May want to ask you to go back and maybe talk a little bit more specifically about the catalytic component, because I think there's some really good nuggets there of information. So I may turn that back over to you in just a few minutes to kind of talk about that. But I wanted to maybe dig a little bit deeper. I know Sasha mentioned and highlighted all the California departments that are working kind of in the housing development space, right? And we work closely with those entities in delivering the multitude of our various funding programs that Craig was highlighting. But I also wanted to mention too, some of the other partnerships that we've really forged with other statewide agencies that have really been critical for our success, right? As we all know, housing is kind of the linchpin that pulls all of these various public policy objectives and goals together, right? So for us, it's been really developing those relationships and learning from them, and also taking the opportunity for us to communicate the importance of housing and then develop shared mutual goals between our various agencies. There's the connection to mental health and homelessness, and we work really closely with the Department of Social Services in that space. Transportation and climate change, and also environmental issues. You know, the Strategic Growth Council, which Craig mentioned, which is our partner on the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, also working really closely with the Department of Transportation, Cal EPA, the Toxic Substances Control Board in environmental remediation activities, which is critically important when you're doing a lot of this infill development. We also have partners that focus in on special needs populations like CalVet for our veterans program. And then more recently, I think with a lot of the investment really focused on infrastructure, we're forging new relationships with our partners at the California Infrastructure Bank. So really looking forward to hearing from Lena and kind of what they're doing on that front. You know, just speaking about the IIG grant program in particular, it is a program that started, we've had, I think what now, maybe 13 or 14 different rounds of funding in that program. And it has grown in shape and scope and size since it was initially authorized, and more recently through this catalytic component, which really focuses on large scale development projects and setting the table for future affordable housing, and not just affordable housing, but actually a combination of market rate and affordable housing development in the future. And we had a really successful initial funding round of that program, making some awards. The awards were up to about $45 million was the max amount. We had several applicants that came in and requested that max, and you may think, wow, 45 million, that sounds like a lot. But we're talking about thousands of units that we're going to be securing with this investment. So when you really break it down, it sounds like a lot of money, but for the investment that we're putting in and what we're getting back out, and also with the incorporation of modular units and factory built housing, we're doing this at a speed that I think we have not seen before, right? We're not necessarily talking about just the sticks and bricks. We're thinking about new ways to do this and ways to incentivize local governments to set the table to allow this to happen. So just in the last 2 years, we've had almost $1 billion in funding allocated through special augmentations of our general fund, and then also utilizing some of the critical federal dollars that have been available for infrastructure funding into this IIG program. It's been a real kind of whirlwind, and I think we've seen some real great successes, and I really hope that we get some additional funding to continue this, because I think it's been one of the probably very it's created a lot of interest across the state, right? Not just in the urban and suburban areas, which you think that would be kind of a typical place where you would see this kind of larger scale development, but we've seen it at the rural parts of the state too. And in fact, we have a set aside within the catalytic program that specifically targets rural parts of the state. We all have infrastructure needs. We all have sites that could potentially be unlocked for housing, but we just need the infrastructure dollars to make it happen. And so that's what this catalytic infill program really seeks to do. Craig, did you want to add anything else about the catalytic program in particular?
Sure. Our infill program is one of our really popular legacy, I like to call it iconic programs. And in the last couple of years, it's morphed a little bit. And this year we introduced the catalytic component that Jennifer described. And it really just broadens the opportunities for communities to look at, place-based development across the entire community. The city of Oakland, for example, was awarded about $45 million. They had 7 housing projects in their application, and our grants will support almost 700 units, mostly affordable housing, but the program also will help fund market rate housing. So it's a great mix. I just want to add also, we added in this catalytic component factory built housing. So while it may be a little bit of a stretch to define housing components built in a factory as infrastructure, we decided that the advantages and the efficiencies brought by factory built housing was worthwhile to incentivize those components in this program. Also, we introduced adaptive reuse. So we know that a lot of us are now working from home, and we have many office buildings and shopping centers that sit vacant or underutilized. So the program will now fund the redevelopment of those structures for affordable housing, which I think is a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah,
sorry, Jen, if I could just jump in, one more thing that I'd add is the, and then I know we need to turn it to iBank too. But just one important component of catalytic is, especially as we were approaching legislative partners about this, is they thought we had specific communities in mind and specific parcels in mind. We're like, no, we're trying to acknowledge the work that local governments have put in to identify these opportunities in their communities. And so one pivotal component of the program is that the infill infrastructure grant catalytic award can go to contiguous or non-contiguous parcels. So if there is a city who says, I am ready to take this award, and this is the area where I need infrastructure investments in my community, and it all touches, it's a specific plan area or whatever the case may be, great, we can fund that particular place. But there are other communities where they're not going to accommodate this amount of housing need, because we were looking catalytic, kind of not code word, explicitly for not just one project. We're interested in how infrastructure investments can trigger multiple developments. And so if the jurisdiction has zoned for and made ready one part of their community, and on the other side of the city or of the town, there's another parcel that's doing the same thing and they need infrastructure investments there, HCD is open for that. And so the communities that were awarded don't always have development concentrated in one part of their community. And we don't have urban growth boundaries like you do. But nonetheless, we still are prioritizing infill. So that was a key component. This is not greenfield development. So can be non-contiguous, cannot be greenfield. Jen.
Yeah, and I was just going to end on talking about while we've had to kind of stretch ourselves here internally and working with partners where it maybe felt a little unnatural at first too, I think we're requiring our applicants to do the same thing, right? For the IIG catalytic component program, that is a grant to local governments. But as you can see, they have to come in with partners that are developing the affordable housing, right? And so we've really tried to, through several of our programs, AHSC was probably the very first program where we kind of forged this, you've got to come to us with a partnership in place, right? We want to see you working together, you local governments working with your transportation agencies, any regional entities, planning entities, also with the actual developers of housing. So we're forging new partnerships ourselves, but we're also forcing our and encouraging, maybe forcing is a little strong, but in essence, yes, we're forcing our applicants to really think beyond just kind of what they do and looking at this from a broader perspective of how we get housing built. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Lena. I'm really excited to see what she has to share about what the California Infrastructure Bank is also doing in this space. Lena, take it away.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank the 1,000 Friends of Oregon for the invite. I'm very excited to be here and to share more about iBank and specifically to do with infrastructure. The one thing I do want to mention is with iBank, we can't really do the actual housing units, but we can do infrastructure around it, which is what really I want to talk about. In the bond unit, we can do up to 20% of a project that includes housing. So there's a certain restrictions we have. I think we kind of look to the other state agencies that are already on the ground to kind of do the actual housing, but we can help with infrastructure around it. So as mentioned, my name is Lena Moller. I'm the Loan Origination Unit Manager at iBank, primarily working with the ISERF loan program, which is the Infrastructure State Revolving Fund loan program. It's a direct loan program. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you an overview of iBank as a whole and then focus a little bit more on ISERF. The California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, or iBank, was created back in 1994. We are housed in the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, also known as GOBIS. And just a quick note on what our current focus areas are. Number one is creating and preserving jobs for Californians, expanding access to underserved communities, being inclusive and intentional in who we serve, and also, of course, addressing climate change. We're expanding our role in climate financing, investing in and enabling projects that are addressing climate crisis in a meaningful way. As you know, we have some very serious infrastructure needs when it comes to like wildfire prevention, biomass, forest mitigation, and projects like that. So we really want to focus on things like that. Next slide, please. So we've got four main units, and in spite of being around since 1994, it often feels like we are the state's best kept secret in financing infrastructure projects. But we're working to get more exposure and do more presentations to change that perception. And the main core iBank units are up there on the presentation slide, the ISERF loan program, climate financing, bond financing, and small business finance center. We do have a new venture capitalist program as well, and a climate catalyst program. Just briefly, on the climate financing side, in addition to the direct lending I mentioned earlier, we do green bonds and provide flexible debt financing through the Catalyst program, which is available to both public agencies and private sector companies. So it has a larger focus because it does include private sector entities as well. The initial focus for Climate Catalyst is forest biomass management, as I mentioned, and utilization, but we're expecting to expand more into smart ag and clean energy transmission projects. That program is funded by the state. The monies come directly from the state. The Small Business Loan Guarantee Program is a major marquee program under the Small Business Finance Center. They work with financial development corporations that then issue guarantees to small businesses. That gives lenders a little extra confidence in lending to small businesses, and also specifically for climate solutions as well. We also partner with the San Francisco Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And now the program has actually gone statewide, where we are focusing on climate solutions, and that program is called Climate Tech. In recent years, we've financed more than $3 billion in green projects. So today we're going to focus a little bit more on the ISERF, or the purple icon, the State Infrastructure Fund, but I'll also cover a little bit about bond financing a little bit later on. So Sam asked me to talk a little bit about how ISERF was first initiated and how it got started, and give a little background. So towards that end, ISERF was established in 1994. It received initial net funding from the state of about $162 million. Since then, we used that money as a revolving fund. So that money was spent really quick, within 3 or 4 years. And then we've been issuing bonds since that time to keep that program going. So it's a revolving fund. We've issued over $1 billion in infrastructure loans to date. We don't run out of money. And that's one thing that I think sets ISERF a little bit apart. Because we issue our own bonds, our very own bond unit issues bonds for us. If the monies are getting low, let's say towards the end of the period and we need to issue more bonds, we will use iBank equity to do bond anticipation loans. And then when the ISERF bonds are issued, then we go ahead and leverage those loans to the ISERF bonds. So we really don't run out of money, and it is a sustainable program. Some of the highlights that I want to mention is we've done about 146 loans since inception. These are larger loans. As time goes on, I'm seeing much larger inquiries for loans. So, but the average over the years has been 6.9 million. The most recent approved loan was 40 million for the city of San Diego. It was a SB 1383 compliance project, organics project for a landfill. We also have done over $152 million in green loans under the ISERF loan program. And what we're really proud of also is the total number of jobs created is over 24,000 jobs. Next slide, please. So who is eligible for an infrastructure loan? They could be any subdivision of a local government, state government, including departments, commissions, counties, nonprofits, really a whole range of them. For JPAs, we have to consider a consistent stream of revenue. The members of the JPA cannot leave during the term of the loan, as that would impact the revenue stream. Nonprofits are eligible with sponsorship from a public agency. Sponsorship could be in the form of a resolution, some kind of monetary support, or a guarantee. It's we kind of look at it on a case-by-case basis. What type of projects can we finance under the ISERF loan program? So a wide variety of infrastructure projects. There is one exception. We cannot actually do the housing in terms of building homes and things like that. That is something that is restricted for us. But we can do infrastructure around housing, as Sasha mentioned and Craig mentioned earlier as well. That is something that we can do under the ISERF loan program. So projects, when a housing development springs up, you've got a need for additional infrastructure around it: roadways, street lights, landscaping, water, sewer connections up to that point of the housing development. You need fire stations close by, you need community centers. All those things are eligible under the ISERF loan program. The loan amounts range from $1 million to a max of 65 million. We can go up to 30-year term loans, which is actually very helpful for some of these communities, because a 30-year loan means a smaller debt service, and that does help, as long as the useful life of the project can support that term. Another benefit to this project is we can do 100% financing, or if needed, if there's grants or matching, let's say federal grants or state grants that are financing projects, and you need us to bridge the gap, we can do that as well. So you could either do 100% of the project under ISERF, or we could have a portion coming from the borrower, or a great state grant or a federal grant. That would all be eligible loan structures. On the climate financing side, again, we are really focused on meeting the greenhouse gas reduction goals, water conservation goals, and environmental preservation. So that's a major focus for some of these programs. Next slide, please. I want to go over really briefly what the benefits are. When I talk to inquirers or potential borrowers, why come to iBank? With iBank, we do save time. We complete a preliminary review prior to inviting you to apply. The whole process from beginning to end, from the initial inquiry to the preliminary review to the board approval, can be as quick as 5 months to 6 months. And then we have 180 days to execute the financing agreement. So that's a pretty fast timeline. We do provide technical assistance. And as I mentioned earlier, we can do 100% financing. Our ISF bond portfolio is in really good shape. We have never had a default. We are AAA rated, so the bonds are AAA rated. And because of that, our cost of funds tend to be lower, and we pass those savings on to our borrowers. We don't have to compete against other, like the applicants are not competing against each other. There is no scoring mechanism. It's pretty much a first come, first serve basis. And as I mentioned earlier, we try to keep the program sustainable by issuing bonds, and there are no application windows. You can apply, borrowers can apply throughout the year. So, a lot of transparency, and our website is really nicely built. We have a lot of projects on our website, and we publish our interest rates on the website when a loan is approved. A couple of things on the right-hand side of the slide there. There are two types of financing structures based on repayment sources. So if the repayment source is a water fund, so you're doing a housing project, and let's say the city wants to build the infrastructure up to that project, we would be looking to the city's, let's say, water fund, if it's a water project or water conservation or whatever they are doing around that infrastructure, to connect the city sewer, wastewater, treatment plant, all of that to the funding, to that housing. We'd be looking at the enterprise fund as the repayment source, and we would take a pledge on those system revenues. So that's kind of how we get our security on that project. If the project is a general fund repayment source, so for example, let's say there's a fire station being built or a community center around, infrastructure, we would do a lease-back type financing, and we can use the project itself as a leased asset or any unencumbered asset. So one of the caveats for this is, the project has to be owned by the public entity, that is the city or the county, and the project has to be on land owned by them and the other borrowers. So that's how these infrastructure around housing loans are structured. We also require an executed reimbursement resolution from borrowers, and this does allow for soft and hard costs that have been incurred prior to iBank financing to be included in the loan amount. So I know there's a long phase of planning and soft costs that are incurred. Those can be included in the loan amount as long as you have a borrower resolution. I tell borrowers, even you haven't been invited to apply yet, you don't know if you're going to get the loan or not, but it's always a good idea to get that resolution. It doesn't cost anything to get that in place, because then the costs you incur can be included. Next slide, please. A few examples of some of the projects we've done. As I mentioned earlier, we've done over $1 billion in approved direct loans under the ISF loan program to date. We did a fire protection, fire station for the Tiburon Fire Protection District just a few months ago. You can see a kind of a range of loan amounts here on the screen. $4.3 million, the interest rate was 4.44. That was very competitive, when you look at the market at the time. This loan closed in February. It was a 30-year term loan. City of Encinitas, this was a very interesting project. It was a streetscape project. They were building roadways, connecting highways to a downtown, accessing downtown, upgrading it, building bike lanes, greenery, and all of that. So all of that was eligible under the ISF loan program. We did a $20 million loan for them at a 3% interest rate. It was a 15-year loan. we've had a lot of inquiries about SB 1383 compliance projects, organics projects, because now there's a mandate that homes have to separate out the organics from their trash, and then it gets transferred and processed so that it doesn't end up in the landfill producing gases and all of that. So the San Diego $40 million project I mentioned a few minutes earlier is one of those projects. It was approved in August, and we are working to close that before the end of December. The City of Watsonville project was also approved last December. This was 7.1 acre landfill site, $6 million loan. You can get an idea, the interest rates are right around 4.5%. That was a 25-year loan. Next slide, please. A little bit about the bond unit. As I mentioned earlier, they do issue our ISA bonds for us. iBank is a general purpose conduit bond issuer. So they're facilitating issuance of both tax exempt and taxable bonds for public or private sector projects, excluding housing. But the caveat there is, if there's a project and you've got housing as a component of it, the bond unit can do up to 20% of the total project cost in housing. So they do have a little bit more leeway to do some housing. We also can do P3 projects, public-private partnerships, and this is of interest to cities and counties with large-size projects. We have a capacity in the bond unit to issue projects over $1 billion. So the P3 projects usually fit into that category because P3 projects tend to be higher than 65 million, which is the ISA loan max at this time. The slide that you're seeing there shows a great picture of the Peterson Automotive Museum in Southern California. This was financed with a 20 million loan, tax exempt, and it had a term of 30 years. So they do a really good mix of projects in California. So with that, again, I want to thank everybody and thank you for inviting us. We really do focus on the governor's initiatives. Those are really tied in very closely to the mission of iBank. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And also on our website, you can sign up for newsletters, and we have a lot of social media platforms as well that you can keep informed about us. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to the organizers for Q&A.
Thank you, Lena. Hi, everyone. I'm Ariel Nelson. I'm part of the lobby government relations team with the League of Oregon Cities. We are an association representing all 241 incorporated cities across the state of Oregon, large and small. We also have similar organizations in California, as well as most states in the country. Really grateful to be here and have this expertise and be able to host this event. This is really, really helpful information, as I think Oregon is really looking to figure out how to target infrastructure resources and bring on new resources to support our housing goals. So bringing it back just a little bit high level, and before I do that, I want to encourage folks to, if you haven't already, add more questions to the question and answer. We've had some good discussions started already, and we'll start to answer some more of these live as we go. So there was already some good discussion here. Just hoping, if, Sasha or Craig, if you want to expand upon the $2.5 million home goal for California. Oregon is in the process of, we are going to be having a similar allocation and goal with the passage of House Bill 2001, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. The state's going to be doing some rule making over the next year or so, and then we're going to actually be seeing a similar, or at least a number created for Oregon and at the local and regional level. So can you talk about that, what that means for a goal? And I also want to add on to that, we don't have identified infrastructure resources in the way that you all have in California. That's why you're here. Can you talk a little bit about, did you have those when California first set its goal, or was that iterative? Would love to just hear more about that process and how it relates.
Yeah, funding is iterative and in a boom and bust cycle, and I wish it was always steady, but it's not. So the combination of bond sources, combination of tax revenues, federal opportunities, and so it has to stay flexible. That's not ideal for housing development, and so we try and remind as many people who will listen that housing development doesn't happen overnight, and really people are building their stack over time. And so as much predictability as we can have is helpful. I will swing back to the planning goal question, I promise. But specifically what we're trying to do, and this is why Craig mentioned the super notice of funding availability, is to streamline as many of our programs and then be able to offer the legislature these kind of programmatic vehicles. And there's been a lot of alignment behind the scenes. Imagine that many legislators want a boutique program, and we had a lot of those. And so there's been a lot of intentionality and focus with the legislature to kind of clean those up, so that even if a program isn't funded right now, if it becomes funded in the future with bond or federal sources, we kind of have a vehicle to deliver those funds, hopefully in a program that's understandable to developers who have been accessing state dollars for these purposes. So the infill infrastructure grant program is kind of the umbrella for a lot of other solutions. There's been iterations to that program as well, eligible uses and things like that. But catalytic is the expansion and really meets that planning component with infrastructure dollars. So swinging back to the goal, and our statewide housing plan is something that we can follow up with the link about, where you can see how each part of the goal is assigned to income levels, and how it's also assigned to different counties. It's worthy of another conversation for sure. And I'm glad that OHCS, I think I got the acronym right, and our HCD team have worked quite closely in just sharing, successes and challenges with our regional housing needs allocation program. We're actually in the process of considering what the next version of RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Allocation, will look like. It's called California's Housing Future 2040. But right now we're in the 6th planning cycle. So planning cycles typically happen on 8-year increments, and the state doesn't move at the same time. So different regions go with their planning cycles at different phases. The 6th cycle, by and large, started with our largest jurisdictions in 2021. And at that time, the state is working, so HCD and the Department of Finance demographic unit works closely together to look at demographic projections as well as existing housing need, undersupply, overcrowding, those types of rates, complicated formula, lots of critique on, are we getting the numbers right? Could there be a different methodology? Yes, there can always be a different methodology, but we feel good about what it's been. But earlier cycles had lower regional housing need allocation numbers. Some of that was because of the 2008 crash, and there was just no ability. There's a lot of complicated reasons, but this cycle, we knew there had been massive amounts of underproduction. We're seeing the physical effects of that through unsheltered homelessness. We are seeing the physical effects of that through overcrowding. And so folks knew the number would be bigger. That number is then set, and it's set for different regions. By the time we released our statewide housing plan, we had made it through several different regions, and we were able to roll every region up and say, for the state, each region and each city and county within that region needs to plan for a total of 2.5 million homes by 2030. And so that is the number that needs to be in everyone's housing element, which is a component of the general plan. It's the only element of the general plan that's approved, reviewed and approved, and it's reviewed and approved by HCD. And they're checking to see if there's enough capacity that's zoned for to accommodate that housing need. Now, of the 2.5 million homes, 1 million of them need to be affordable at or below 80. We break it down at low income, very low income, extremely low income for us. At 30% of AMI is included in very low income. So this is where statute and housing development and programs kind of all weave together, but that's the basics of it. Once the RHNA is assigned at the regional level, then it is assigned to local governments, and through MPOs and councils of governments, there's consultations. That process was much more clarified in this cycle, and also reckoned with principles of affirmatively furthering fair housing, because in prior cycles, there were winners and losers in how the regional housing need was assigned. And specifically, exclusionary and traditionally exclusionary communities had effectively lobbied to have a lower allocation. And this is how, really notably, everybody knows where Beverly Hills or knows about it. In the prior RHNA cycle, the city of Beverly Hills was assigned a RHNA of fewer than 10 housing units that needed to be produced in an 8-year period. 10 homes. Shockingly, Beverly Hills far exceeded that goal. And so it was just a good example of like, okay, these are not being assigned equitably. We need more transparency in how this is being assigned. Very political process. It ends up being very complicated, but 2.5 million, very long answer. But I think I broke down some of the key components.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to Ron's question, which I think was shared during the presentation on the iBank, but I'm curious for all of the programs, how have you experienced any issues from small service districts, like water districts or cities, taking advantage of these programs, whether it's financing or grants? I noticed in one of the earlier presentations, you had a small cities focus. Curious how those discussions with your local government partners have gone, and if there was any barriers that were overcome or retooling of any of these programs to reach the smaller jurisdictions or smaller grant recipients.
Yes, small service districts do contact us. We have worked with a few of them. There's been a couple of times where, we have a cash flow issue where really, because of the ISA bonds, we have to repay those bonds. So we have to make sure that the cash flow is at least break even, we prefer it to be like a 1.2 coverage. We will look at projections as well. So that does help. Many times they're projecting developments or increased user charges and fees being collected. So we can include that in our analysis as well. Sometimes we've had to go back and say, well, are you applying for any grants or federal or state, or have your own reserves because maybe they don't cash flow for all of it. So we do look at those inquiries a lot, but we have a little bit more work to do sometimes to get those through.
And I would say on our program side, we have and continue to make like adjustments as necessary to allow smaller localities to take advantage of our programs, particularly in the IIG program. We have different definitions of what constitutes an infill site, right, from a smaller, more rural jurisdiction than we would for an urban jurisdiction. So yeah, I think those are just some of the lessons learned as you get a couple years of funding under your belt to kind of learn what's working and what's not. The AHSC program is our only program that really allows for special districts to apply as eligible applicants, and they probably would not come in alone for funding, but would come in as a partnership depending on what they're actually seeking to fund, if it's the housing, if it's the infrastructure, if it's transportation component, right? And I'm not sure, Craig, maybe off the top of your head, if we've had many special districts. I know we allow it, but I don't think we've really seen a significant kind of like uptick in those types of entities applying.
Agreed. Yeah, I don't think we've received any late.
I think we even allow school districts to apply. Like it's a pretty wide open. I think getting some of those folks into these partnerships is maybe a little more challenging, even from our affordable housing developers too. So
yeah, and I think that may be kind of the connection to federal funding, IIJA, bill, all of the federal infrastructure funds, knowing that housing is not really named explicitly. That is, I will not be fatigued by that point, but just to say that it was cut through negotiations as having a major kind of highlight within the infrastructure funds, but water, energy, transportation, definitely named, definitely a lot of funding. And so I think, again, going back to the concept of having these programmatic vehicles, how can our programs play well with others? And so if there's funding that's going to a special district or a water district's eligible, we would love to be able to show that we have a framework that could support them in deploying those dollars to support housing. And so I think that's one way that we can all kind of look at those federal infrastructure opportunities and think what would be useful to make it easier to and less expensive to build housing. I'd say, candidly, the prospect that we've raised to our infrastructure think tank here in the state, and it's not just Lena's team, but a whole network of state teams that are looking at federal funding, is to say, we have an opportunity here to leverage these once in a lifetime federal infrastructure investments and explore the ways that infrastructure can make it easier to build housing. Or we can pretend like we don't know that that's a thing. And then in 10 years, we'll look back and we'll say, okay, housing, go ahead and build all of the housing. And by the way, you're going to need to redo some of this infrastructure because we weren't coordinated. That's the value proposition that we can bring to other partners who are really holding the keys to some of those dollars and say, you can facilitate outcomes that achieve multiple public policy benefits here. So I think as housing professionals, we have both an opportunity and responsibility to communicate the ways that we rely upon and can benefit from key infrastructure.
Thanks for that. A couple follow-ups. I apologize if you touched on this, but part of Ron's question was, would emergency services, fire, life safety, be eligible for these programs? But I'm hearing that it's really more the capital kind of physical infrastructure. Or could you clarify which it is?
I think on the adaptive reuse components, Craig and Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've named fire, life safety, fenestration, things like that, just kind of known challenges with adaptive reuse of what it takes to convert commercial to residential. I don't know if our IIG program, but certainly when we talk about adaptive reuse, this has come up in home key as well. We are not trying to ignore the significant needs for fire, life safety upgrades, but I haven't really thought about it beyond that. Shannon or Craig?
Right, for the absolutely capital expenses for fire, life safety, seismic, all of those elements would be eligible for the IIG adaptive reuse funding.
Thank you. And then following up on, there was a new question kind of along this trend about smaller rural government. So the question is, many rural government residents can't afford increased fees to repay, so grant programs are really important. How do you help these small districts with staffing needs? A couple questions in one.
Some our AHSC program, for example, does provide some funding for administrative costs from local governments in the administration of their grants.
And we have there's other programs, not always just for rural applicants, but to acknowledge that there's a capacity building component that can often be required. Just yesterday, for example, the Strategic Growth Council took on a capacity building new pilot specifically for tribal governments and with staffing as an eligible expense. So that's not the only way, and I can acknowledge that capacity building can be a bit paternalistic, but just go with me for just a moment. But just the idea that sometimes it is staffing needs. Now, the ability for us to sustain funding for that can be quite challenging. And so going back to those planning grants that I mentioned, sometimes we were hiring a bench of planning consultants who could then deploy to have more specific conversations with local governments. We are not opposed to really working in partnership to get those plans tuned up, deploying that consulting bench, or working with HCD staff directly to iterate on programs that will help achieve the goals. And so we bake in a lot of TA, even technical assistance, even if we can't fund staff directly. And then we know we need to do a better job of helping folks wayfind for these investment opportunities and funding opportunities. And if you have a staff of one, it's really hard to go in and apply for a grant that's 3 or 4 times your current salary. Like, there's no capacity for that, right? So we've done things, and actually the Interagency Council on Homelessness does a good job of this, of just to show the web of resources that can help local communities plan for and respond to homelessness. We could do the same for infrastructure.
Yeah, I would just add on
If
to
folks
that.
haven't seen it already. Last thing, Jen, promise. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has a new tool that's helping to wayfind within federal infrastructure opportunities. It's version 1, they've told me, and they've said like this will not be the totality of the opportunities that we share, but HUD is trying to show where federal infrastructure dollars can be used for housing and community development purposes. And so more of that. More of us explaining and making it easier for folks and not needing an advanced degree to understand or to always rely on grant writers to be able to access these opportunities. And so I think that's part of our responsibility as public employees to make it easier. Jen, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to give this specific example of what we've done in coordination with the Strategic Growth Council on the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. We have run for the last several years a technical assistance program through that. With external partners that work on behalf of the state agencies to help identified applicants that don't have the capacity. Now, it's not long-term, right? It's not helping them like hire up staffing resources, but it does help them be able to access these critical dollars by providing actual application assistance. We've also played a role in kind of, we used to call it like matchmaking, right? So we would do these upfront technical assistance conversations with potential applicants that are trying to pull together a project, but because of, they just don't have the knowledge of who to reach out to, we would kind of play this, we joked about a love connection, right? Between an affordable housing developer and maybe a local government or a transportation agency too. So we try and do that to help folks.
Do your agencies have any regional staff that are kind of, locally based around the state to kind of help with some of these conversations?
We have some regional offices that work primarily in our codes and standards division, right? This is something that has been kind of an ongoing discussion about whether HCD also should, the other parts of HCD should also have kind of regional offices and regional staff. We have over the years done like regional office hours. We'll send staff down to that area and have them just kind of available to meet with potential applicants or folks who are interested in a variety of different issues, not just on the financing side, but also on the planning side as well. But currently, no, we don't.
Right. I'm going to ask another question here. Can you, let's see, how do you ensure, so we know there's not enough funding to go around. Obviously, you touched a little bit on that earlier. So how do you ensure equitable distribution of funds and grants around the state in the face of high demand? Are there key criteria in your program that have been helpful to kind of ensure resources are having an equitable reach? And that, I guess that could be geographic, it could be size of entity, nonprofit, it's back to the small city, small jurisdiction issue.
It's really hard. Jen, can I give the home key example first?
Please.
Because I think that
sure.
one's interesting. So in the home key statute, we were charged with equitable geographic distribution and then left to guidelines to be able to develop what that meant. And so in that program specifically, where we're trying to address homelessness, really interesting model that we've used is to look at continuum of care as the region. But then we have some pretty small COCs that functionally like the balance of state. And so we have our bigger regions represented, and then we have the balance of state pool. And within that, we've used the point in time count. And then we've also used other HUD data, specifically like extremely low income and at risk of homelessness, and kind of use those two factors to say, okay, if we had to split the state population, here's percentage-wise what this would look at when we're thinking about homelessness. And so that then splits the state into regions and apportions the funding for each round. And what we've done is then say, we will hold for some period to those geographic regions so that it's not just a free-for-all. Basically, that those regions have a chance to come in and kind of compete against each other instead of the smaller jurisdictions competing against the city of Los Angeles. it's not a fair fight, especially for the same it's not a fight, but I mean, you see what I mean? Like the same question about a rural jurisdiction with the capacity of one staff who's going to be applying for it, and they're going against the city of LA, not cool. So we have, but still the program really incentivizes and requires acting with urgency in line with our statewide housing plan. And so we can't wait forever, but we hold this period for folks to come in by region. And if the funds are subscribed for that region, great, that's who gets funded. If the applications do not fully cover what we've apportioned for that region, then it goes back to the general pool. And so I think I just wanted to raise that example because whether it's for homelessness or infrastructure, there's a way to kind of say, here's where we know what the need is. Let's have those kind of like for like communities explore the opportunity together, have a chance to apply before we're living in a land of oversubscription. Jen, please, I know you wanted to say something too.
Yeah, no, I think you gave a great example on the Home Key program. I would say almost every single one of our funding programs has some sort of a regional distribution kind of baked in, and it really depends on what the funding is being used for. If it's a home ownership, we look at home ownership rates, right? So each different program has maybe a different breakdown of what a region looks like. In the infrastructure programs, we typically look at large jurisdictions versus small jurisdictions, and we run those programs separately. So for IIG, we have a separate notice of funding availability that's just for small jurisdictions, right? So they're not competing against these large guys, right, that are coming in. And in our multifamily housing program, we have targets that are northern, southern, central, rural, right? So it just depends on the makeup. Most of that is defined through our guideline authority. Sometimes it is part of our statute that we have, but it just kind of, it varies program to program.
Thank you for that. And I know there's a few more questions that we didn't get to. Some more questions digging into the differences between developing infill versus greenfield and the efficiencies involved. I don't know if it's possible to maybe share something written in response, but we're going to take the last few minutes to get kind of a final impressions, final round from our presenters. Thank you so much. Would just love for you to share what your key takeaway is for this group. And I think one of the questions that I think Sasha was maybe hoping to answer anyways was about bringing in more federal grant dollars and maybe some opportunities there. So I don't know if you want to start, Sasha, mind taking that and share any other closing ideas you want to leave.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. I swear I will find the HUD wayfinder. But I think there's a great opportunity for us to continue working with other state partners. I can say certainly within the state of California, but I think every state can do this as well, to help make these connections that Congress didn't make of how housing is related to infrastructure. And that if we are centering people in the needs of people, we're not going to have good public policy outcomes if people don't have safe and stable housing. And if we're doing workforce development projects that are funded by infrastructure, where will people live has to be a foundational question, because otherwise we're going to have very nice things. And I'm going to swing for the infill question to kind of why. Again, you all have urban growth boundaries really targeting development in certain areas. And I think that's one very powerful tool. Something that isn't really baked into the way that our cities and counties work all the time is that city managers are on a shorter time horizon than some of the decisions that they may be working on. And so the current city manager may not see the long-term cost of infrastructure decisions to take it out to greenfield. But the maintenance of that infrastructure is going to be very expensive over time and perhaps make municipal finance very difficult if there's no other resources or no other need to upgrade that infrastructure. And so one thing that I'd say is we're exploring things like the social and carbon cost of sprawl. And we don't have research or calculators on that yet, but we're encouraged by that. Also saw that the Office of Management and Budget is considering the social cost of carbon in some of the federal infrastructure opportunities. And I think that is a signal that it's not saying that you must build infill, but you do need to think about the greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by your investments. And so infill decreases drive times. Infill allows us to repurpose and reimagine and bolster existing infrastructure that otherwise will crumble. And so while I may get my AICP planner card pulled for this, I would say that when we think about adaptive reuse, it's not just about buildings. We should think about the bones that are going to support those buildings, and that is the infrastructure. And there is a financial cost and there's a societal cost to doing nothing. And so I'm ready to keep thinking about ways to make these connections real outside of decarbonization, but more explicitly into deeper infrastructure connections. Thanks, Ariel.
Thanks for that. Go ahead and open it up. I don't know who wants to go next. Final thoughts for that.
I can go next. I think we're in the best of times in that, local governments, state policymakers, federal lawmakers and policymakers and funders, they're all aligned to a large extent with similar missions and goals when it comes to housing, climate-related infrastructure, upgrading failing infrastructure. And so towards that end, we do have a united front, but it takes time to network and get the word out and see how better these different entities and partners can work together. So that's where I think work needs to be really done. But it's very, I see a very good future for some of these projects because we're all united and having the same mission.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that. I think, it's a real exciting time for housing, just generally, right? I think that folks generally now really understand how critically important housing is. We all see it in our day-to-day lives. We all know someone or see someone or know a friend of someone who has had challenges, right, in securing safe and affordable housing. And so it's our moment, right? And some of these partnerships and reaching out to folks that may not feel like they're part of our kind of like housing circle can feel intimidating, right, and unnatural. But this is the time to really kind of like lean into that and develop these relationships. We've got all of this momentum behind us, pulling together state resources, federal resources, looking across policy objectives of transportation and infill and environmental issues and climate change. Like everything's happening in our favor right now to have this be something that we can kind of move forward. So that would be my takeaway.
Those are great comments, Jennifer. I agree completely. We're while we have this 2.5 million planning goal, as Sasha described, we're looking at all of the other sort of co-benefits to providing this housing and infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. So if we were solely focused on, okay, we're just going to build the houses, that would be easy. But I don't think it would really get us to where we need to be as a state and as a society. So we're looking at connectivity with our transportation infrastructure, our sort of regular infrastructure components that benefit not just the housing development that's included in the application, but it does a lot for the surrounding community. So while we try to focus a little bit on our numbers, there's a lot more happening that's not as quantifiable. So that's important to keep in mind when we look at that 2.5 goal that is in the distance.
Thank you. And with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and the work that's been ongoing in California. We will be sending the slides, copies of the Q&A that were written with the group, as well as I think there were some great links shared so you can see some of these completed projects, see how these programs are structured in more detail online. Please do reach out either to League of Oregon Cities or 1,000 Friends or any of the hosts if you have additional questions or materials we can help get for you. Thanks for joining us today. And for those who are watching after the fact, we are grateful for tuning in. I think, at least speaking for the League, but I know we're all here because in Oregon, we're very motivated and invested to tie some of these critical infrastructure resources to our housing goals, and looking forward to working with everyone on helping make that happen and partnering hopefully with our Western coast states on some additional federal advocacy for those important federal dollars. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your weekend.